All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Brian, everybody, thanks for having me. My name is Chris Patosha. I'm an Associate Director with Environmental Health and Safety, and this afternoon we're going to be talking about hazard awareness and emergency response for you as fire safety directors here at the university. So we'll go over some basic concepts about hazard recognition. We will go into some response actions that we will potentially ask of you in the event of an emergency response. And we have a couple of scenarios to sprinkle in as well, and we'll talk about those along the way. So just quickly, a little bit about myself. I've been with the university for, it'll be 16 years this August, but been with environmental health and safety that entire time, and have had really just about every job that you can have in the department. So I've got a fairly good scope of knowledge about our operations and about the different things that happen here on campus. We've worked closely with facilities, with fire safety, with public safety, throughout that time in a variety of different capacities, mostly including emergency response and including training. I will say, in those 16 years, this will be the first time that I've ever delivered this particular training. So, so forgive me if I, stumble in any way. And by all means, even though we're, on video here, feel free to ask any questions. They may be the same questions that your colleagues who are seeing this in the future may ask along the way. So I think without further ado, we'll get started. As I mentioned, here's our overview. We're looking to provide a general hazard awareness for you, particularly within and around the laboratory environment. So this is a different workplace than you would have if this were, an office complex or, a facility that didn't have hundreds of laboratories on its campus investigating, different types of scientific questions in all of the different disciplines that are here on campus, and how to respond in the event that there might be an emergency in one of those laboratories or around one of those laboratories. For the most part, this will focus a lot on after hours response. During regular business hours, which are sort of broadly defined as 8 to 5, 8 to 6-ish, environmental health and safety will be on campus. A lot of what we'll talk about will be the role of the fire safety director in the context of a literal first responder. In the event that one of the FSD team members are here before, we're able to arrive to the scene of an incident in a laboratory. So again, we want to understand what the different roles are between the fire safety directors, between environmental health and safety, as they relate to emergency preparedness and response to potential hazardous materials incidents in or around the laboratory. When I use the term hazardous materials throughout the rest of the presentation, it will be referring collectively to those categories that you see here: chemical materials, biological materials, particularly potentially infectious materials, and radioactive materials. There's a section of the presentation related to fire and life safety. Clearly, I'll be preaching to the choir when it comes to those topics, but we'll go over a very brief review of race and pass and response to a fire on campus. And we do have them from time to time. So we'll start with the recognition and evaluation of hazards and talk specifically about ways to identify hazards. So before we even get into anything particular related to chemical labels, hazard signage, anything else along those lines, your eyes, ears, nose, all of your senses are important means of recognizing hazards. You can hear things, see things, smell things, observe things when you are in when you are in and around a laboratory area, and when you're responding to an incident. That can go a long way toward telling us and telling you and making the information available about what could be happening in that area. From there, taking those initial cues: are we seeing something? Are we hearing something? Smelling smoke, smelling the odor of a chemical, whether it's a solvent type smell or something else that might be irritating or otherwise, we'll then begin to look deeper for more particular information about what might be involved. And again, if we think about this in the context of a first response, the scenario could be that you're on scene and communicating via radio or via telephone with myself, with someone else from environmental health and safety, about what you're seeing, about what you're hearing, about what you're smelling, and then answering questions that we might be posing about what you're seeing in terms of available signage, in terms of available labels, in terms of other specific information that might be discernible to you on scene, while we, in some cases, might be off-site. And so we'll be looking for some of the feedback that you can provide to assist us with triaging that incident and determining what the full scope of the response might need to be. So we'll talk about signs and labels a little bit. They are different things, and obviously they're very closely related, but generally speaking, signs are the information that you would see outside of an area or on a piece of equipment, whereas a label is going to be found on a container specifically. An important difference between labels and signs is that labels are required to conform to something referred to as the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling, or GHS. And so if you're familiar with a material safety data sheet, those are now referred to as safety data sheets. They used to be MSDSs, they're now SDSs, and part of the changes that went into the adoption of the Globally Harmonized System was not only that change in name, but it was the changes to the uniform layout of safety data sheets, which we'll talk about in just a moment, as well as a uniformity of layout for container labels. So all chemical containers are now required to bear a label that provides this information. It doesn't have to look exactly like this, perhaps the supplemental information is on the other side, or vice versa, but it does have to have the information that addresses each of these different categories: the product identifier, the supplier, precautionary statements, which are canned, pre-written information from a large portfolio of statements within the globally harmonized system that speak to precautions that a user of that material should take. The label needs to bear the hazard pictograms, and then a signal word. There are two signal words. One is danger. Does anybody know what the other one is?
Caution.
Warning. Yeah, warning and danger. With warning being kind of the lower hazard. Hey, be warned, there could be a hazard here, versus danger, this is a hazardous material. And then there need to be the hazard statements, which again come from a pre-canned list of GHS hazard statements, and then supplemental information, which can be anything. So some of those will have directions for use, some might have an expiration date, or other things like that that could be of relevance to a user of that material. So if we're able to identify that there's a chemical involved, all of the information on the container label can be very, very helpful to us in helping understand what might be the appropriate response. Somehow these circles didn't line up quite right, but that's okay. The other sort of defining feature of GHS is that now all of these pictograms, is what we refer to as these red bordered symbols, these pictograms are now all universally the same. Now these are distinct and different from DOT hazard markings and placards. So as you're driving down the New Jersey Turnpike or elsewhere and you see a gasoline hauler with its flammable placard on the back, that looks different. That's red with a different icon, and it's got its UN identification number. That's because that is a Department of Transportation placard for that material being in transit on the road. These are the GHS pictograms that are required on chemical materials, on chemical containers, when they are used in any kind of commercial activity. And so you can see the different health hazards or physical hazards that they represent. Again, this is really only the first layer of information when you're looking at the container itself, because as you can see, a number of them have multiple bullets below for additional information that they could mean. So for example, you could have a flammable solvent, let's say acetone or gasoline, something that we're very familiar with. You would very much expect the flame pictogram to be on a container of that material. You could also have a pyrophoric chemical, something that's reactive in air, that if you open that container, it will burst into flame. Clearly, those are two completely different hazards, the gasoline versus this pyrophoric material, but it's the same pictogram. So you can't take at face value that this is, the equivalent hazard to the gasoline that you're familiar with. It could be something that's far more hazardous. And so we do need to understand more about these materials, and some of the additional ways that we can do so are through the use of an NFPA diamond, which now gives us some relative ranking of the different hazards of the material. And so everybody's familiar here with the 4 quadrants of the NFPA diamond, kind of working clockwise around with the health, flammability, reactivity, and then the field for special hazards. A lot of times there you'll see the W with the line through it for water reactive materials, or a C for a carcinogenic material, things like that. And again, with the 0 to 4 system in the NFPA diamond, you do have a relative ranking. So that gasoline might be a 3 on the flammability scale as compared to that pyrophoric material, which would clearly be a 4. Which now brings us then to the safety data sheet, and really the best source of information for chemical users and folks responding to any type of chemical incident. So under the globally harmonized system, the safety data sheets, as I mentioned, now have a uniform 16-section layout. Again, they won't all look exactly like this when you get a safety data sheet from manufacturer A versus manufacturer B. One could have a blue border, one could have a green border, the different aesthetic appearances, which are not impacted by GHS, but they all will have the same 16 sections, all in the same order, from the identification of the substance through the hazard identification information, exposure controls, the physical properties. All of those will be on the safety data sheet and all in the same order. So any of them will have that information. And all of those are available to university personnel from any university computer within a IP range that we've provided to a vendor that we partner with called ChemWatch. They're available from any system on campus through the EH&S website. We have a specific safety data sheet page. You can open up that page and retrieve any safety data sheet for any chemical. So these are among the sources that we'll use to obtain additional information about those chemicals. So that's a little bit about signs, labels, safety data sheets, and the globally harmonized system in general. Let's move a little bit more into some other signage that we will find on campus in different areas, including some that are now outside of the chemical hazard arena specifically. So does anybody recognize the two signs that are on the top? See nodding. What are they?
Radioactive.
Yeah, the radioactive, trefoil, the magenta and yellow, and then the other? Biological hazard, right. So let's talk about where we might find them and what those mean. So we've talked a lot about chemical containers. You might find a toxic pictogram there, and then you might find these signs or other labels on different equipment as well. So what we see on the right-hand side there is a biological safety cabinet, which is, for all intents and purposes, it's the biological equivalent of a chemical fume hood. It works differently. There's a filtration mechanism here as opposed to a direct exhaust mechanism, but this is the engineering control that is used when working with potentially infectious materials. And you'll have the biohazard sign on equipment like that. You'll have the biohazard sign on waste containers, and you'll have the biohazard sign outside of any laboratory where this type of waste material is produced. So something that's very important to point out for anyone who is responding to a lab, from a fire safety director to a public safety officer to a facility staff member, is that when these signs are outside of a laboratory, they represent a hazard. However, they don't necessarily represent a risk. And those are two different things, and I want to spend a moment there. So the hazard being the property of being able to cause harm to life or to property. Risk being the likelihood that that harm will occur. And so those are two things that have to be considered when you understand, or when you consider how challenging a situation might be. And that is the reason why we use all of the different controls that are in place in a laboratory, whether it's a chemical fume hood, whether it's a biosafety cabinet, whether it's all of the administrative controls that are used to collect and manage waste properly. It's to minimize the risk. The hazard is there, but we minimize the risk by handling the materials appropriately and using them in the appropriate places where they belong. So that is an important thing to understand. So again, when you walk into a room where this placard is available on the outside, it doesn't mean you've entered an environment where you're going to be exposed to an infectious material. It's to represent the fact that that hazard is there. Keep in mind, there are folks that work in these laboratories all day, every day, and they work in them, and they do so using these different controls and using the different means of limiting their exposure to lower the risk. So you'll see these signs on storage areas, you'll see them outside and on doors, and you will see them in other locations throughout the lab, such as on those particular pieces of equipment that we mentioned. So we have a couple of specific door signs that are worth mentioning here, and they're used to communicate different potential hazards, and in some cases specify protective equipment for working inside. So we saw the radiation hazard sign a moment ago. We have a sign here that captures a lot of information that's required to be posted on all areas where radioactive materials are used. And so at the Morningside campus, there among the several hundred laboratories that are here, there are a couple of dozen that are licensed to work with radiological materials. These are radioisotopes that are used in very small quantities and of very low activity, so far lower activity than you would ever be exposed to when you have a dental x-ray or if you have an MRI or anything along those lines. These are generally materials that are added to cellular systems or other biological systems to kind of trace and visualize biological activity. That's really the short version of what radiation is used for in most research activities. And so that being said, all of those laboratories, again, are licensed. Those licenses are applied for and granted through our office. All of their acquisition of the radiological materials is tightly controlled and approved by our office and limited to the particular amounts that are stipulated on their licenses. So then we have a broad scope license to be able to grant folks the ability and the privilege, to be able to use these materials. And part of the license requirements for us is that all of this information be posted and made available for individuals who are using these materials in the areas where they're using them. So this is really, again, just standard language that needs to be posted, these lab regulations and this sign that's referred to as the notice to employees. We then have a couple of signs, the one that you see here related to cryogenic material, and we'll talk about oxygen sensors in a few minutes. But again, this is a hazard-specific sign related to the alarm that we have in some of these locations for this sensor here that monitors oxygen sensors. So in areas where there are greater than 60 gallons of cryogenic materials in use or in a dispensing facility, the fire department requires us to have oxygen monitoring equipment in place during those activities. And so we have real-time, full-time, direct reading oxygen sensing equipment. Most of them look like this. There are about 100 or 150 of these deployed between our couple of campuses in locations where we have these cryogenic materials, which are mostly liquid nitrogen, to monitor oxygen. And so, as you can see here, this one is monitoring and it's indicating that there's 20.9% oxygen in the room, which is about what you'll find in any ambient indoor environment. When this drifts below 19.5, the sensor goes into alarm. That's at a level that's very comfortably above any kind of biological level where someone would pass out, where someone would have any kind of mental impairment or otherwise. So there's a nice margin for error there because the alarm is set at that higher level. So if and when this alarm goes into or this sensor goes into alarm, yes, there's a need to evacuate the space. Yes, there's a need to understand if it's a false alarm and do other backup investigation to understand if there is a potential asphyxiating environment. But there is a little bit of room to be able to do that safely. So we've also done, when this requirement came into effect, when the fire department required these sensors to be installed, we, along with some other stakeholders in the New York City research community, did some modeling to help understand. Frankly, we didn't want to install these, and we thought it was kind of an impractical request on the part of the fire department. And so we did some modeling to understand if we had a 60-gallon tank of liquid nitrogen and the entirety of it released into the space at once, would it cause an oxygen deficient atmosphere? And those models indicated the answer was no. So these are generally very safe locations to be, in spite of the fact that this liquid nitrogen is there, and in spite of the fact that from time to time these sensors do go into alarm, either because someone was dispensing the liquid nitrogen too close to the monitor, or because most of the time the sensor drifts out of calibration or expires. So we do have alarms. I think we have, it's hard to hear, but we have some audio. That's what the alarm sounds like. It's a lot louder, a lot more, shrill if you are nearby. But that's, it's a loud, high-pitched beep. Each of them does have a sign that indicates what to do in the event of the activation, which, again, in short, is to evacuate the space and to contact public safety. Now, if on your rounds during, an evening patrol or during a patrol by public safety, they encounter one of these, public safety as well as your team are equipped with these sensors to be able to bring to the location to verify that the sensor that is in alarm in the field is in fact not a false alarm. So when you can compare the one alarm to the other, you can verify that you either have a legitimate oxygen deficiency situation or almost certainly a sensor that's out of calibration. The important thing to understand here, so this is the other type that's deployed across campus. When we have laboratories that are newly constructed and have a need for the use of these materials, they're required to install a permanently mounted sensor, and so these have a much longer sensor life and are replaced every 10 years as opposed to every 18 months or so. But again, an important thing to understand is that the area needs to be evacuated, and in the extremely unlikely event that there is someone in that space that's incapacitated, it's critical to not rush into that space until it can be verified that there isn't an actual oxygen deficient atmosphere. So this happens very tragically. You hear about worldwide, you hear about these types of incidents almost always in things like confined spaces, when someone is overcome by some type of oxygen deficient atmosphere. And when there are fatalities in these types of situations, it's almost always more than one person, because the initial person is overcome and then a second person rushes in to try to help them, and then sometimes even a third or more, and they become these terribly compounded tragedies. So again, in the unlikely event that there ever is an incapacitated person that you can observe in an area where this type of alarm is sounding, it's critical to not rush in until it can be verified that there's not an oxygen deficient atmosphere. And you can do that by bringing the portable oxygen sensor to the space. One of the other areas where, in addition to the liquid nitrogen, where you'll find additional oxygen monitoring equipment are in areas where there are NMR magnets. These are nuclear magnetic resonance magnets, the same type of magnets that are in MRI, and that are also used in analytical chemistry to understand the properties and the molecular makeup of different compounds. So there's some of these in the Havemeyer building, there's a couple of them in Jerome Green, there are a couple of them at the medical center, and so there are both MRIs and NMR instruments. So the couple things to be aware of here, so there's also the hazard posed by the magnet of these facilities, but there's also an oxygen deficiency hazard here. So these magnets have a jacket, if you will, of insulation that is a cryogenic fluid, because otherwise they would heat up and basically melt. So they're surrounded generally by liquid helium to keep them cool. In certain failure scenarios, so one, for example, if the instrument were physically damaged, and in others there's just sort of like an end of life scenario for the magnet, where it could undergo something called a quench, where all of that helium could be released. Again, very rare, the folks who operate and own these magnets monitor the magnets, the different performance of the magnet to make sure that this doesn't happen, because again, as I mentioned, this is sort of an end-of-life type event for the magnet, and these are very, very expensive. These are multi-million-dollar instruments, so folks who own and operate these are interested in having this not happen. But if the cryogenic insulation is lost, it can be released into the room, can result in a release of helium, which again, in theory, could displace the oxygen in the room and could cause an O2 sensor to go into alarm. So the same instruction would apply here. Don't rush in. Verify that the room and the atmosphere has returned to a normalized situation for occupancy with an appropriate level of oxygen in space. So outside each of these laboratory locations, so you have the specialty sign here and then the standard sign on top, all of our laboratories are posted with 24-hour contact information. And this is a key piece of information that I, if my phone is the one that rings at 2 o'clock in the morning, and if I'm in communication with someone who's here in the field during an after-hour situation, I'm going to ask, whether it's public safety, whether it's an FSD, to tell me what the information is on the outside of that door, and then we'll speak to the folks who have their emergency contact information posted to help understand what's taking place inside the laboratory. So the kind of tongue-in-cheek example that I always use is, if the green slime is floating out from under the door, I'm going to call and say, well, what are you doing inside that's causing that to happen?
Is your name and number on all of these tags?
No, so these are the name and number of people from the lab, right? Because as much as we establish and maintain relationships with all the laboratories, it's just impossible to know what's happening in all of them all the time. So the type of question that I would be asking to that proverbial situation would be, well, what's happening in the lab? Are you running any kind of equipment? Is there anything that could be causing a flood to come out from under the door? Is there anything that could be causing smoke inside the lab? Is there anything that could be causing an alarm, which is quite common? And generally, these aren't hazard alarms. They're sort of equipment maintenance alarms, or maybe somebody left the freezer door open, something like that. So that's the purpose and that's the utility of the emergency contact information outside the door.
Being the guy responding after hours.
Right.
I'm calling.
You'll call environmental health and safety, and then we'll contact.
We'll give you the
Yes.
whatever information you're asking for.
Yep, exactly. All right, so again, we've talked about using your senses. We've talked about listening, looking, and hearing, which is really the perfect the perfect response in the event of an oxygen alarm, because you're going to potentially see a plume of gas, almost certainly not, but you'll be hearing an alarm, and again, using your ability on site to understand if someone is trapped in the space or otherwise needs assistance. And so again, the normal range of oxygen is 20.8 to 21. Those sensors will go into alarm at less than 19.5, which again is a wide margin of error before you'd have any kind of really acute physical response. That's not going to happen until below 18 or so. That said, again, if that goes into alarm, it is time to evacuate. So we could have an alarm sounding inside a laboratory. This is the first of a couple of scenarios that will appear. We have the sign on the door, but we do see an unconscious person inside the laboratory through the door. So what are we going to do?
We're not going to go in.
Absolutely not. No, we're going to do what it says on the sign. So we're going to contact public safety and then follow the instructions that are on the door. So prior to entry, assume that the activation is valid. Don't enter. Contact public safety and be prepared to provide information to responders. Keep the scene secure, and then also when speaking to public safety or when speaking to any other colleagues who are on scene, the FSDs here are equipped with those gas clip oxygen sensors to be able to verify the legitimacy of that alarm and whether or not it's an actual oxygen deficient atmosphere. But most importantly, don't rush in. All right. equipment. So we have other laboratory hazards and other laboratory alarms that can go off. So on the left is a fume hood alarm. So these are alarms that are intended to let the laboratory workers know that the face velocity of the fume hood has dropped below a compliant range. You have alarms that are on many -80 freezers. So these are freezers that are preserving research materials. These go into alarm again if a door is left open. These generally have preset temperatures, ranges where a researcher is going to want to know whether or not that freezer is holding the appropriate temperature. And so these don't necessarily indicate a hazardous materials incident. These generally indicate a need for a researcher themselves to respond to evaluate whether or not there is a problem with that freezer. All right, so shifting gears to biological materials, I mentioned that these indicate the presence of potentially infectious materials, and you'll find the biohazard sign on doors, on waste containers, and on certain pieces of equipment. So again, the sign represents the hazard, but not necessarily an indication of the risk. Walking by one of these containers, walking past this equipment, walking into the lab is not putting you in a position where you're going to be infected or exposed with something. You have the same type of sign on those pickup containers that are outside the hallway of your doctor's office, on the same signs that are on the outside of the door of the exam room when you go to the doctor. So again, these are there as a requisite indication that the hazard is there. How hazardous are these materials? So everything that is used here at the Morningside campus and at the Medical Center campus, with the exception of a single laboratory at the Medical Center, is going to be of BSL2 or BSL1 hazard level, with the vast majority of that material being BSL1. So these are materials that are otherwise not known to cause disease in healthy adults. So these are strains of E. coli, yeast, other biological microorganisms that are potentially infectious and are important to handle in the appropriate way, because we don't necessarily know by looking at someone what their immune status is and what their health status is. And we have portions of our population, the elderly, the very young, for example, who aren't quite as capable of resilience to infection from those materials. But for healthy adults, these are materials that are not known to cause disease. We then move to BSL2, where we would have the potential for infection, but only by direct contact. So what's meant by direct contact? So this is things like MRSA, things like hepatitis B, and even HIV, so potentially serious diseases, but only transmissible via direct contact. So contact with blood, bodily fluids, with your mucous membranes, or with non-intact skin. So if you're splashing around in blood and bodily fluids, that's a risky activity. If you're coming into contact with these materials with non-intact skin, or getting it in your eyes, nose, mouth, or mucous membranes, that is a hazardous activity. Again, walking into a location, passing by a location, those are not a cause for potential concern or potential transmission from a BSL2 organism. Again, as opposed to BSL3 or BSL4, where these are serious diseases that are potentially transmitted via the airborne route, so via droplets that can be in the air. So things like tuberculosis, and then of course at BSL4, Ebola. And so these are facilities and materials that are handled only in locations where there are extra layers of engineering control to the facilities themselves and to the practices that are used for handling the materials in order to prevent transmission via the airborne route. So it's always the use of those biosafety cabinets that I mentioned, which are also used for BSL2 materials, but are a requirement at BSL3. But more importantly, it's specifically constructed facilities that negatively pressurize the air so that it's always going into the facility. And then there are other much more stringent waste management guidelines, for example, that are required at BSL3 and BSL4. And again, just a word on BSL3 and 4, one laboratory at the Medical Center, and then BSL4, none at all anywhere in New York City for that matter. So BSL4, there are only a very small number of locations worldwide, and these are generally governmental laboratories where they're able to handle these materials in safe conditions. These are, when you watch movies, the folks who are in these fully zippered suits with the, pressurized air supply and things of that nature. All right, so what types of incidents of a biological nature might a fire safety director encounter? So you could see a leaking red bag or a sharps container, an odor from regulated medical waste, or an improperly discarded sharp object. So, from time to time, this does happen. And again, even in a scenario like this, encountering this material is not going to pose a risk to someone unless you're coming in direct contact with that blood or bodily fluid. And again, encountering an odorous container of regulated medical waste, clearly we want to address that and get that problem solved, but it's not a risk to be concerned about in terms of transmission of any kind of infection. Likewise, seeing a sharp on this table or seeing a sharp improperly discarded in a regular wastebasket, something that we want to address, something that we want to remove to its location, but as long as you're not touching that, as long as you're not receiving a puncture wound injury from that, not a hazard for transmission of any kind of infectious microorganism. So what to do? Again, we're going to isolate this area and use the appropriate means to collect that sharp, and we'll generally either just again have the container isolated or have the area isolated. So again, as a hypothetical example, if there were a needle sitting on this table that someone observed during rounds of public safety or an FSD, we'd close the room and then have someone come back and pick it up with some tongs and get it into a sharps container. If we observed this leaking red bag, that one would probably want to have someone from environmental health and safety respond and get that cleaned up. But again, not a risk if we can safe off that area and not have anybody come into contact with the material. All right, so we just sort of talked about this, the red bag leaking in the hallway. There's no identifying marking or no one in an adjacent laboratory present. So again, we secure the area with caution tape, contact environmental health and safety per our emergency call list, which we have divided by category. So a biological incident at a particular campus is going to route you to a particular member or members of our team who can assist with that. We would ask on site that an FSD help with interviewing people in the area so that we can understand, did this come from laboratory A, B, or C, and then we can then further investigate what were they doing, what did they discard here, and what do we need to do to change their practices. There could be the option down the line to review CCTV to identify if someone had improperly transported something to a location where it didn't belong. Any questions about biological materials before we move on to radiation and radioactive materials? We've talked about the sign, a couple of other things that you might see here frequently in different areas where these materials are used. The Geiger counter, this is a very common instrument. In fact, all of our laboratories are required to have the means to detect removable contamination of any kind of radiation that they might be working with. Our staff do quarterly surveys of every laboratory that is working with RAM, which is an acronym for radioactive material, using different detection methods to make sure that they haven't spread any kind of contamination within their work area. And then the item that you see here on the bottom is referred to as a PIG, and it is simply just a lead jar that a radioisotope, if it requires shielding, is shipped in and is stored in so that there's no risk of exposure. For the most part, as it relates to fire safety directors or public safety staff, the type of incident that an FSD might encounter as it relates to radiation would be a loading dock alarm. So the improper transmission of radioactive material outside of a building where it doesn't belong. And so this is generally going to happen at the medical center where there is a loading dock alarm that is a radiation detector. And 9 times out of 10, when that is activated, it's because of transportation from the morgue and a deceased cadaver being transported out of the building after having some type of interventional radiology type treatment. So maybe there's some type of radioactive prostate seed still implanted.
The guy that had the seeds.
Right.
Every time you walk by, the
Right.
seeds would go off.
Right, and so if an individual is deceased but still has something like that, whether a thyroid implant, a prostate implant, it could trigger that alarm, and our staff can respond and identify identify what has happened. The other scenario that happens is, a UPS driver or a FedEx driver who's just coming from their cardiologist after having had a stress test, a cardiac stress test, will activate that alarm on their way into or way out of the building, and we'll have to flag them down and say, hey, well, you're setting off our radiation alarm.
I know a guy that got pulled over by the police. They had a van, terrorism thing.
Right.
He had just gotten caught in.
Triggered alarm.
And pulled him over.
Wow.
He was like, I just left the doctor.
Right.
However, they were scanning at the time.
Wow.
The van picked it up.
Pretty sensitive instrumentation they have. Wow.
You had to show them the paperwork. They just
Wow.
came to the doctor, the test stuff.
So what happens? Yeah, and there's a variety of causes outside of anything suspicious or or of concern that can set these alarms off. Outside, again, this is the same message that I'm trying to reinforce as it relates to biological materials. Again, outside of posted laboratory areas, there's no risk of exposure, and in fact, inside these areas, the handling, the monitoring, the work practices for these users of these very low energy radioactive materials limit the potential for exposure to almost zero, and that's the extensive dosimetry history. So we have all of the users of these materials wear a dosimetry badge. The badge itself doesn't do anything to protect you, but the badge will detect whether you've been exposed to radiation over a quarterly or monthly period. So we have thousands of these badges in circulation. They've been in circulation over years and years and years, so millions of records that have indicated close to zero exposure to laboratory users of radiation. And those are the users themselves, as opposed to someone like a fire safety director, even an environmental health and safety staff member, transiently going into and out of a laboratory. So our exposure is going to be zero. So the three main principles for protecting yourselves from radiation exposure are time, distance, and shielding. The shorter the amount of time that you're exposed to radiation, the lower the dose you'd receive. The farther away, the lower the dose, and then the use of appropriate shielding will protect you from any kind of exposure to these materials as well. So if we have a radiation alarm triggered on the loading dock, again, secure the area. This is what we would ask of an FSD. Contact environmental health and safety, interview people in the area, and then along with public safety, we almost certainly would use CCTV to identify what happened here. Did something go in or out of the loading dock, or otherwise cause that alarm to be triggered? So in the context of any hazardous materials incident, I want all of you to remember that your safety is the priority. We want you to assess the scene from a safe distance, take action only if you know it can be done safely, and really what we're asking for on the part of environmental health and safety is your assistance on scene, gathering critical information. What do you see, what do you hear, what do you smell, if anything? Through the use of the different instruments that I'll talk about in just a moment, are you able to detect anything that would indicate that there is a hazardous materials release? So what should that involve? The name, the uni, and the phone number of a caller. If anybody has reached out to you to initiate a response, what is the location specifically, the name and the quantity of a hazardous material released. A lot of this is borrowed from a presentation for public safety as well, so you won't necessarily be receiving this information via a phone call, but if you're speaking to someone on scene, the same would apply. We would ask that any kind of chemical name that is recorded, you ask an individual to spell that chemical name, and I'll talk about exactly why that's important in just a minute, but helping us understand the extent of any injuries, any kind of damage, and EH&S will always recommend medical evaluation if someone has or believes they have had exposure to a hazardous material. We're not medical professionals, so if someone asks you or is asking you to ask us, what should I do? Should I go see a doctor? The only thing I can say is, out of an abundance of caution, yes. I can't say whether or not they should. So they always, if they have any, if they feel any need for additional clinical evaluation, the answer is yes. So what additional assessment capabilities do you have at your disposal? So a couple of tools. The oxygen sensor we've already talked about. pH paper is very useful for the preliminary evaluation of liquid leaks. So the proverbial green slime coming out the door, out from under the door, but really the much more likely scenario is the clear puddle from under the door or in the middle of the hallway. It's almost always water. and dropping a strip of pH paper on there and having it come back pink is what we want to see, as opposed to bright red or dark blue, indicating that it could be some kind of acid or some kind of alkaline basic material. The combustible gas detector, or we refer to it as the TIF, so very useful for detecting gas leaks, and we put gas in quotation there because a lot of times people will call in, or you'll be dispatched to a quote-unquote gas leak, because people just sort of default to the word gas when they smell something. There are research chemicals that can cause gas odors, or mercaptans. As you know, the mercaptan compounds are added to natural gas because natural gas is naturally odorless. So there are other research chemicals that have those same sulfur compounds that can cause folks to call in gas odor complaints. So the TIF is useful for finding actual gas leaks, and there are suspect sources of these that you can investigate if there is an actual gas odor upon response to an area. The photoionization detector is a little bit more qualitative than the gas, and than the TIF gas detector, because this will tell us if there is the presence of a hazardous material that is a volatile solvent. So if we walked into this room a few hours after it was freshly painted with a photoionization detector, we'd get that being activated because you have volatile organic material in the air. And really, again, going back to the sight and sound, consider the area. Is there a sink or a water source in the area when you encounter that clear puddle? If so, the saying, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses. It's almost certainly coming, from that sink, or from a nearby pipe, as opposed to something, where you're really trying to connect dots that aren't necessarily there. And what's the context of the building occupancy? Is it a research building, or are we here over in B230 and looking at a clear puddle? I don't think there's going to be a hazardous materials leak if you encounter something in the hallway. There's very unlikely going to be a hazardous materials leak in the hallway of a residence building or an administrative building as compared to a research building. So we're very fortunate now to have access to FaceTime and other video calling technology, because this can, as close as I can get from my couch to being in the hall with you is through the use of FaceTime or another video calling option. And so we use this all the time now for communication with an FSD on site or a public safety officer on site for real-time assessment of emergency conditions. So we might ask you to connect via FaceTime or whatever type of video calling option you have to help us gather information remotely. So again, your personal protection is paramount. Only ever attempt to turn off the source of a release. If you see a lit Bunsen burner, only ever attempt to turn that off if you can do so safely. Again, with any kind of source of ignition or anything else that you identify or encounter. So fire safety, again, a topic very familiar to all of you. If a fire or life safety condition exists, everybody is familiar with RACE and PASS. So RACE, what to do in the event of a fire; rescue, alarm, confine, and then extinguish/evacuate. So rescue yourself and all persons in the immediate area, particularly those that need our assistance. Pull the alarm, whether it's a pull station or other alarm activation, and then notify public safety. And then confine the area by closing the door. So in laboratories in particular, all of our laboratories are built with either 1 hour or 2 hour rated construction. So closing that door will confine that fire for 1 to 2 hours. And again, I don't have to tell you how important that is for the bigger picture of response, for keeping that fire in that location, confining that hazardous smoke to the particular location of the fire, and then evacuate either horizontally through an adjoining building or vertically using stairwells. If using an extinguisher, the acronym PASS, as you know, pull the pin, aim at the base of the fire, squeeze the handle, and sweep from side to side. We always tell everyone the extinguisher is a one-shot deal. If one attempt to extinguish the fire with a single extinguisher doesn't work, we don't hustle around trying to find a second one and a third one. It's then time to race out of there and evacuate the scene. After an extinguisher is discharged, if you're able to successfully extinguish a fire, stay on scene, monitor for any kind of reignition. Again, using these interview of people nearby, attempt to determine what caused the fire and what was burning, and then environmental health and safety will respond to the scene and work with facilities to clear the space prior to any kind of cleaning or repair that needs to take place in the affected area. Questions about fire safety before we talk about chemical safety for a few more minutes? All right, so this is back to the point about asking folks to spell the name of a chemical or very clearly understanding exactly what was involved in a hazardous materials incident. So, you're talking about the difference of one letter in the first two examples, sodium azide versus sodium amide, and then the difference of just a couple of letters and a very similar pronunciation between hydrochloric acid and hydrofluoric acid. And sodium azide, you're talking about a pretty routine toxic material that's found in a lot of labs, versus sodium amide, which is a highly water reactive, highly air reactive material. So totally different spill and response scenarios between those two. And then hydrochloric acid and hydrofluoric acid, both acids. Hydrofluoric acid is actually the weaker of the two, but it's far more toxic because it seeks calcium in your body and has the ability to interrupt calcium channels, which are very important for cardiac function and other critical life preserving function. So exposure to hydrofluoric acid is a critical first aid life safety emergency, whereas hydrochloric acid may cause an acute burn and clearly needs to be cleaned up and addressed right away, but hydrofluoric acid exposure requires hospitalization and immediate medical attention on a critical level. So very, very important that we get that right. We have locations where hydrofluoric acid on this campus in particular is routinely used, particularly the clean room on Sepser 10. So that is a location where they do the development of experimental silicon wafer chips and parts of superconducting silicon wafer technology for use in a lot of different electronic applications, and hydrofluoric acid is an important material for cleaning and etching of silicon and some of the other materials that are used in that laboratory. And so there can be a spill of that material there. The clean room itself also has very specialized alarm and detection equipment because of the other materials that are used there. So, in the event of a response to that area, it's very important to immediately contact public safety, who will initiate an emergency response that involves the activation of a command center outside of the Sepser building on 120th Street. But much the same as the other response scenarios that we've talked about, it's important to gather the name, the uni, and the contact information of any individual involved, and then assess the area for evidence of hazardous materials, and then contact environmental health and safety. All right, so just wrapping up, your personal safety is of the utmost importance. We will never ask you to or expect you to involve yourself in any kind of situation that would put you in harm's way. If you can safely do so, address fire and life safety issues immediately. Again, turning off an ignition source or a source of anything that might be contributing to an emergency situation. We shouldn't assume that hazardous materials incident has or will resolve itself. So don't walk away from something that could be a hazardous materials incident without notifying public safety and/or EH&S. But do so after gathering pertinent information and using the investigative tools that you have at your disposal, including the whether it's pH paper, the O2 sensor, the PID, or the combustible gas meter, and then remain available for communications and assistance up to and including the use of FaceTime for additional investigation. Are there any questions? All right, that's all I have for you this afternoon, so thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions or you think of anything later, don't ever hesitate to reach out to EH&S, to myself in particular, or to any of our team who can provide assistance. Thanks very much.
Thank you.